Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the third chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, and the title being The Genius for War. The text follows. Every special calling in life, if it is to be followed with success, requires peculiar qualifications of understanding and soul. Where these are of high order, and manifest themselves by extraordinary achievements, the mind to which they belong is termed genius. We know very well that this word is used in many significations which are very different both in extent and nature, and that with many of these significations it is a very difficult task to define the essence of genius. But as we neither profess to be philosopher nor grammarian, we must be allowed to keep to the meaning usual in ordinary language, and to understand by genius a very high mental capacity for certain employments. We wish to stop for a moment over this faculty and dignity of the mind, in order to vindicate its title and to explain more fully the meaning of the conception. But we shall not dwell on that genius which has obtained its title through a very great talent, on genius properly so called, that is a conception which has no defined limits. What we have to do is to bring under consideration every common tendency of the powers of the mind and soul towards the business of war, the whole of which common tendencies we may look upon as the essence of military genius. We say common, for just therein consists military genius, that is not one single quality bearing upon war, as for instance courage, while other qualities of mind and soul are wanting or have a direction which is unserviceable for war, but that is an harmonious association of powers, in which one or other may predominate, but none must be in opposition. If every combatant required to be more or less endowed with military genius, then our armies would be very weak, for as it implies a peculiar bent of the intelligent powers, therefore it can only rarely be found where the mental powers of a people are called into requisition and trained in many different ways. The fewer the employments followed by a nation, the more that of arms predominates, so much more the prevalent will military genius also be found. But this merely applies to its prevalence, by no means to its degree, for that depends on the general state of intellectual culture in the country. If we look at a wild, warlike race, then we find a warlike spirit in individuals much more common than in a civilized people, for in the former almost every warrior possesses it, whilst in the civilized world masses are only carried away by it from necessity, never by inclination. But amongst uncivilized people we never find a really great general, and very seldom what we can properly call a military genius, because that requires a development of the intelligent powers which cannot be found in an uncivilized state. That a civilized people may also have a warlike tendency and development is a matter of course, and the more this is general, the more frequently also will military spirit be found in individuals in their armies. Now, as this coincides in such case with the higher degree of civilization, therefore from such nations have issued forth the most brilliant military exploits, as the Romans and the French have exemplified. The greatest names in this and in all other nations that have been renowned in war belong strictly to epochs of higher culture. From this we may infer how great a share the intelligent powers have in superior military genius. We shall now look more closely into this point. So, finally we have started the third chapter of the first book that, as you have heard, is about the genius of war, the military genius, if you prefer. Now, this first passage, as you know, at this point, these chapters are relatively long, so we split them into several videos. So, this is just this first part. Of course, the whole chapter is long, right? So that's the sequence, and we're gonna, I don't know how it's gonna take now, but this first passage is particularly important because it already sets the ground to very important methodological approaches to not just military theory, naturally, but military history as well. And I think it's particularly significant, especially to challenge certain conceptions related to the so-called idea of warrior that are a bit, at best misunderstood and definitely abused in their use in today's pop culture, and they tend to distort not just what in fact the military should be, but also in fact the Clausewitzian theory that is behind it. So here von Clausewitz introduces this by saying every special calling in life, if it is to be followed with success, requires a peculiar qualifications of understanding and soul. So this is already very important because you realize that what it takes fundamentally to be capable in every endeavor, in every activity, is not just only intelligence, nor just only spirit, but fundamentally a combination of both. And this is particularly true in war, as we will be seeing now in this chapter and beyond. Von Clausewitz continues saying, where these are of high order and manifest themselves by extraordinary achievements, the mind to which they belong is termed genius. I remember years ago I was asking, how do you define? I was interested in military genius specifically, but this really, as you have understood up to this point, von Clausewitz really makes many points that are applicable even beyond military theory. The genius here is very simply defined. Von Clausewitz is very effective, and this effectiveness is not due to simplification. It's really what the best way you can define it. Von Clausewitz is pragmatic. He's interested in everything that works effectively, right? And not just that he pretends to work, but how it effectively works. So here, the definition of genius is not a complicated one. You don't have a particular set or combination of achievements that you have to reach to be qualified as such on the basis of certain minutiae or details. Simply, when this understanding and soul qualifications that are peculiar to the relative field are of high order, that is to say that they are extraordinary. The term extraordinary is very flexible, as you understand. Well, that's genius. So extraordinary simply means that it goes beyond what is normality. That is the average, if you want. So it is what is different from mediocrity, and also in here, where you decide what genius is relatively arbitrary, but at the same time, naturally, you have to identify it in someone who stands out for a reason or another. And I can't stress enough how it is important here to see the genius as a combination of intellect and spirit, because this is what even neuroscience tells us, that being intelligent, for example, being wise or being motivated are very different things, and they don't automatically work together. There are people who are extremely intelligent but turn out they can't accomplish much, and vice versa. Naturally, I believe on average, at least the most intelligent people tend to apply themselves better, but also they need something else, something more than that, because otherwise, it's like the instrument. You need to know how to use it, and that doesn't necessarily come from birth. Like, you have to build on it. So, well, whatever. This is another topic. But going on with von Clausewitz, he says, we know very well that this word, the genius, is used in many significations which are very different both in extent and nature. and that with many of these significations, it is a very difficult task to define the essence of genius. And that's basically what we're doing here, is that you don't really know what, it's relatively foggy to define, right? You don't have a real measure, a real standard you can apply. But von Clausewitz here says doesn't practically matter, because here he says, as we neither profess to be philosopher nor grammarian, we must be allowed to keep to the meaning usual in ordinary language, and to understand by genius a very high mental capacity for certain employments. So here you understand perfectly von Clausewitz's pragmatism, but also modesty, because you can definitely argue that von Clausewitz is a philosopher, and he is a grammarian. The way he writes is beautiful, it's brilliant actually, and he makes a very accurate and proper use of words. So obviously he had definitely a greater education, could even encompass this. But here that's where intelligence really works applied. He is trying to make you understand something that goes beyond that. We don't have to spend time arguing, debating what genius, how can be defined. Let's simply say he tells us that genius is simply that person of a very high, at least, mental capacity for certain employments, which is what is used usually, in fact, in ordinary language. Von Clausewitz goes on, we wish to stop for a moment over this faculty of dignity of the mind in order to vindicate its title and to explain more fully the meaning of the conception. But we shall not dwell on that genius which has obtained its title through a very great talent, on genius properly so called, that is a conception which has no defined limits. So what he's saying here is that we're not now necessarily, obviously we will look at certain military genius, we can make many historical examples about this, but what here von Clausewitz is making us focusing on is what this quality fundamentally is about, right? So where this genius can be found as a quality that fundamentally can be shared by essentially everyone. It's as if we were all, at least in minimal part, sort of genius, because this is a quality of the mind, wherever you want to put it, and this is something that can extend even from the individual to not really to communities, meaning that it's as if they had a broader mind, but let's say that the interaction of these geniuses can produce larger effects in politics, in society. And von Clausewitz goes on saying, what we have to do is to bring under consideration every common tendency of the powers of the mind and soul towards the business of war, the whole of which common tendencies we may look upon as the essence of military genius. So in other words, we don't have to concentrate on saying, oh well, that guy over there, that's a genius. No, well, you have to understand what's the essence of military genius, so that it can even be able to eventually point out that it's there, and how it's produced, how it's formed, how it's cultivated. And he says then we say common, for just therein consists military genius, that is not one single quality bearing upon war, as for instance courage, while other qualities of mind and soul are wanting or have a direction which is unserviceable for war, but that is an harmonious association of powers in which one or other may predominate, but none must be in opposition. So this is also kind of a very fascinating philosophical concept. That is, he takes the example of courage, right? He says, courage is definitely one of the ingredients that make the essence of the military genius. But courage alone is useless. Courage alone may make you charge against a machine gun nest, and you're simply dead. So yeah, courageous, fine, a hell of a way to die, but that's not necessarily what brings you to win that encounter. In fact, you're dead. And so this is valid for any other quality. Then now we're just introducing the topic, but at a certain point, Von Clausewitz makes effectively a list of all these qualities and defines them better, even makes a list of psychological profiles, essentially, that tell you may even look into them. For example, I think that I definitely not have a particularly great military mind, but because I have certain qualities of my mind and of my mind in terms of intellect and spirit, soul, that maybe are not so great for not enough for having this essence of the military genius. And the essence of military genius is something very difficult to have. That is, geniuses are not born frequently like in any other activity. I mean, in terms of human prototypes, I mean, it's very rare to be an extremely courageous person, an extremely intelligent person, extremely, extroverted person. And most of us are simply pretty mediocre, which is fine. You are in the larger group, then that's the only consolation. It's really not. But this is really, in fact, something that goes beyond most of the times, and that therefore cannot be pursued like just obviously this genius, let's say, can be improved. I mean, if you definitely carry out military studies, you probably, at least now, let's not descend in what this means practically in our societies, because really, strategical culture is something very difficult to obtain, both in the civilian world, but also in the military today, but not because today it's worse than it had ever been. And now von Clausewitz will also show this, that not every military man is definitely a military genius at all, and there wouldn't be armies basically if this was the case. And now we have even read it, if you remember. Now we will read commented on now. You can definitely improve, right? It's like intelligence. The myth that you're born intelligent fundamentally is a myth. In fact, intelligence is built up through education, through certain endogenous factors that build it up and then shape it in a certain way. So, in other words, on average, the more educated person tends to be more intelligent, but it doesn't necessarily stand out in geniality in this sense. So not always that can be the case, and especially that may not be a matter of intellect. Education develops intellect. Here von Clausewitz is clearly telling us that that's not enough. You can be the most intelligent person, but if you're a coward, if you can't take risks, if you're not resilient, if you don't have cold blood, and if you can't see straight through certain things, you simply can't be a military genius. And you can be content, at least that it is pretty normal not to be one. So running after it, pretending that we just because, for example, we study military history, probably we understand something more. And actually turns out that sometimes military historians are better even than certain military men to understand what war effectively is. I mean, not from an emotionalistic side, which obviously I don't. I hope I will never have to experience myself what it means to be, out there under enemy fire and watching your friends die and all this stuff. But the idea is that war is something that goes far beyond that, and something that requires basically a lifetime of learning that should be ideally to cultivate the military genius, both theory and practice. That is to say, studying respectively military history and actually leading men, or at least exercising at the best. I mean, theoretically it's possible even for non-military men, people that have not led armies, to become sort of good commanders in theory. I mean, it's like coaches, like trainers. It's very rare to find a trainer that has not been, a former sportsman, right? But there are exceptions. They are exceptions, but they do exist. But they're not the norm, definitely. So it's something very complicated. It takes a lot of years, and definitely if you but this is the point, that there are factors that sometimes you don't come to control. I mean, for example, if you by nature, by character, you don't have a resolute character, or you are insecure, or you have, but it doesn't even take to be chronically insecure in this sense, or with any other element it can, well, that's gonna be a great problem for you. Right, so that you may be, for example, in that case, you may understand war, but not necessarily becoming a good commander because something different is required. However, there are also different levels of let's say, of employment of this military genius that definitely grows in, as such, in the more you grow in the hierarchy, right? You would think that generals should be endowed with a sort of military genius. The soldier in the front line shouldn't. I mean, he can definitely have some qualities that have to do with, coping with the situation, but the more you raise through the ranks, the more you realize that especially more intellectual effort is required to be brutally approximated, but it's not all about that. The soldier has to be courageous, so something more like a fighter, in the sense, in the physical sense, or at least the qualities that make it so. And the general should be someone who is intelligent as hell, right? In order to make, and unfortunately, it's not always like this, and this obviously depends. Not just on how the military is shaped, but also primarily actually how policy and society are in that case. But this is another topic, and it's relatively out of this. We'll talk about it in another time. So, but what here von Clausewitz stresses and is fundamental is that there is a set of qualities that make the essence of the military genius, that however they have to interact, they have to be associated harmoniously together, and they act as powers, right? So they all have a capability, they all have, if you want, an effect on each other, but they have to be perfectly harmonically, let's say, balanced in order to give you that essence. So that in other ways, even if you have ingredients for cooking something, it doesn't just take to mash them randomly together to have a decent meal, right? You have to calibrate this with, and unfortunately, this is not a matter of it's way more complicated than that, because obviously this have to do with qualities of your intelligence and of your spirit that are very difficult to alter. So that there are obviously individuals that are better predisposed, as we were saying, for this, but they also tend to be very rare and to stand out. And still, you can argue that perfection doesn't belong to anyone. So at the end of the day, even a military genius is very rarely complete. I mean, even if you look at military history, there are many great political and military minds, right? But it's very rare, for example, to find good commanders that really are capable of doing everything, even looking at every single aspect of the military and managing to master them. There are certain commanders that are so good that, especially at command, maybe they do not reform the army, or maybe they don't leave any new theory on it, or maybe they do not improve, they do not innovate a big much. So obviously doors are still big because they manage to accomplish great things repeatedly, because they evidently have a talent, a genius in fact, but they're not always complete. So this essence of military genius, I think, is brilliantly extrapolated from the individual context by von Clausewitz in order to be explained, because it makes you understand that still it's differently modulated according to every person, and that what it really counts is more or less how this can be defined. And then you can get closer or kind of more distant from it, depending on who you are. So this is important, and here it also says, in fact, if we have read it, that that in fact all of these powers that are harmoniously associated form the essence of military genius. Definitely can singularly, one of them can even predominate over the others, right? There can be good commanders that maybe are very good because they're very bold. So it's likely that has to do also with a higher amount of courage, not necessarily that they're less intelligent, but maybe that they're willing to risk more. But at the same time, what is important at the end of the day is that these elements are not in opposition, and actually they always are by a certain degree, as long as also they are harmoniously associated. So that is very important to consider, because you understand that there are great military minds that at a certain point make their own mistakes. I mean, take, Napoleon. Napoleon did mistakes and still was one of the highest military minds of his time, definitely so, and rightfully so. But being a great commander, a great talented general for real, doesn't necessarily mean you're always going to make the right choice, but especially also that doesn't mean that you're going to win anyway. In a war, take Hannibal, that is rightfully one of the greatest military genius of all times. Well, he lost in the end, and that didn't matter that he managed to defeat the Romans so clamorously, so frequently, still lost. So it's definitely, you don't have to put the genius at the center of everything, and we have always to remember that war is just the continuation of policy by other means. That is to say that the military instrument is just a tool in the hands of other of policy, and that's really what interferes in war all the time. So that you don't have a free military genius. No general. Remember what we said in the previous videos, that no general can think to ever even be a good general. As a matter of fact, if he believes that when he's on the field, he's detached from policy, because it's never like that, and it's not like it's never because you can approximate maybe sometime. No, it's constantly like that. I mean, literally everything you do is connected to policy, to politics and society, even when you are on the battlefield, right? Okay, let's passing on. Von Clausewitz says, if every combatant required to be more or less endowed with military genius, then our armies would be very weak. For as it implies a peculiar bent of the intelligent powers, therefore it can only rarely be found where the mental powers of a people are called into requisition and trained in many different ways. So in other words, if you, first of all, military genius is very rare to find. As we said before, there are very few people who are like that. So either if you, even if you trained everybody to, even to be a military genius, because that's the real point, you wouldn't necessarily have a very functional army. First of all, you would have a very small army in the first place, because a real military genius, so someone who stands out, is very difficult to find. Secondly, that's not really all what is called. It's like when Frederick the Great said something. I don't know whether it's really a statement of his, but it was said, that if my soldiers started to think, I wouldn't have an army. Well, this is pretty much it, really. the human material with which you make up an army is not required to have a military genius in itself, and there are other other ways here, as they are called, that to which a society has to work in order to draw the necessary material and human ingredients to make a real army. And the military genius has its special preferential role that has to carry out certain things, and now we will partly see like that. So then von Clausewitz goes on, says the fewer the employments followed by a nation, the more that of arms predominates, so much the more prevalent will military genius also be found. So here von Clausewitz is starting to introduce the comparison between well, actually not really, but he will now start in the following phrases. What he's saying here is, however, that the more a nation is developed, here von Clausewitz, he's a man of the 19th century, he makes this distinction between the civilized and kind of primitive or uncivilized peoples, right? Obviously, we know what he means now, so we have to understand him in his contextualizing in these words in the mind, but he uses this dichotomy that is obviously theoretical, even in Clausewitzian thought, to make us understand the extremes fundamentally. And here basically says that the more developed a nation is, and the easier, let's say, it's to find those resources fundamentally that can develop a military genius. That is basically a development in the applications, if you want, even in the hierarchies. That is to say that more developed societies fundamentally are more stratified, right? And this certification is functional exactly for the sake of its direction. So this is a topic that we touched actually very often on Schwerpunkt when talking about the differences between in fact more developed societies and kind of, I don't know, tribal and tendentially more warlike peoples. Observing that there is a hell of a difference between, for example, something like collective training and individual training. I mean, you can't even be the best warrior ever, but once you find a civilized army, that you're a disciplined army, you're done for, because individually you may be superior to one of those soldiers, but there is no comparison. To make an example, I don't know, between a Maori warrior and a 19th century, say, British soldier in terms of individual training. The Maori warrior is a warrior. He is being bred in military training in war. But obviously the 19th century British soldier is a professional and also well trained, but he has to do relatively less. He has to fight prevalently information, etc. So at the end of the day, guess who wins? That's the counterintuitive, if you want, because, and this is really a very widespread prejudice. I mean, the idea that there are certain peoples that are kind of more warlike by nature and therefore they're some sort of superior. Here von Clausewitz simply says it's completely the other way around. There's nothing like that. It's as if the more the people was abstracted from that, let's say, warrior mentality, the more it can achieve, because simply those primitive societies are the ones that have this spread military capability among the individuals, because that's the most effective means that they have to cope with the situation, right? Civilized nations do not need this. They need to be better specialized within the same society in order to achieve much greater effects with actual less commitment, right? So this is maybe something we will deepen on another occasion. Here it's well explained by von Clausewitz, and it's relatively tricky, however, to read the terms in here. Maybe they do require a bit of an explanation, because I'm sure someone by reading this passage would think that it's instead just still like a praise towards the warrior. It's absolutely not the case, and that's why more developed societies are more powerful military entities. But let's read this once again. So okay, and here, by the way, von Clausewitz is referring specifically to the incidents, the frequency in finding the military genius in the more developed society, and now we will see why. Von Clausewitz says, but this merely applies to its prevalence, by no means to its degree, for that depends on the general state of intellectual culture in the country. And now we explain better what it means, because by the way, I would say what this phrase really means is that being developed is one thing, but also let's say the difference is in potential between let's say more developed nations are usually greater, right? Because it's relatively easier to given the powers involved to lag behind, for example, to someone else. I mean, there are great, if let's say if a country is politically weak, well, it can be as developed as it can be, but it still will kind of suck at military, right? Which doesn't mean that a primitive people is better than them, because it still can annihilate them, but still, compared to another nation that has instead a very well regulated, very well balanced and functional dynamism and connection between policy, war, and society, well, that will work really better. So that's where, in fact, the intellectual culture here comes into play. That is to say, I don't know, look at the 1870 war. That is incidentally a consequence also of the Clausewitzian thought and work, because Prussia and with the other Germans was fighting according to Clausewitzian doctrine now by generals that had been bred into the Clausewitzian thought, and annihilated what was believed to be rightfully, by the way, the strongest military at the time. It was the French one, that gets really smashed by a power that was weaker than her. So that's really a very brilliant example of the story. But here von Clausewitz goes back on the dichotomy civilized and uncivilized, on the modern and the primitive, if you want, but very bad terming here, but still maybe effective. So he says, if we look at a wild warlike race, then we find a warlike spirit in individuals much more common than in a civilized people, right? So it's what we said before. If you take, erase the term modern, because I have scruples and conscience problems that it's nothing to do with being modern. Take 18th century warfare. The Europeans could be as modern as they could be. They were, beaten and defeated countless times by primitive peoples all around the world in their colonial expansion. So that's not really a determinant factor. Here it's a way more difficult thing. Here it says, basically, if you look at that wild warlike race, the best examples you can have in mind are the barbarians, these really warlike peoples that were all about war fundamentally. They were more primitive, definitely, in terms of political and social complexity. They were smaller things. Then we find a warlike spirit in individuals much more common than in a civilized people. Right, and the reasons are many to this. they have to do also with the lack of, let's say, well, this is really gets complex, but obviously has to do with what you have to live with. That is to say, the more you have, the less you need basically to go out there and fight to take it. But at the same time, and we'll see now, what you lack is a centralized, stronger power can say, impress or a strong discipline on you. That is to say, what the modern military does. Most of our militaries now are volunteers because we fortunately live, by the way, in a peaceful period. So there are people who are willing to go there to be, very heavily trained to be soldiers, and to fight and to kill. So which is very tough to do, and that's why not everybody's fit for that. And that's why. And interestingly enough, that's not even a physical problem. Most of the times, you are excluded by those selections even before the training because of mental matters. And that's the majority of people who get out of the military selections, not because they're not fit physically, but because they're not good at that type of activity, which is also highly represented by the mind overall. Even if they are soldiers, for whom we say, regular, privates, let's say, for which we said that militarily speaking, what you need are relatively more spirit capabilities, and that's why the reason, I don't know, the majority I was looking at, I don't know, I think it were U.S. statistics. The average U.S. military man is more intelligent than the average U.S. civilian by standard, because the selection required that, because still war requires you in order to function to have certain capabilities that definitely are not a joke, right? If you are in a situation where you have to risk your life and the one of your own comrades, you have to have the qualities to come out of there alive, and preferably with all your other colleagues, let's say, our comrades, and so this is important, right? In the warrior, in the tribal society, what you have is that everyone is basically about war, right? The barbarians, who make this broader, useless, sometimes a very approximate term, were warlike people. So this is to say that the freeman was a warrior, and they didn't do anything else, because their duty was simply to fight and either to die, and then if you're dead, you don't have to take care much of worldly affairs, or if you survive, you have slaves who work for you because you've vanquished them, and you have enough power on your own. You don't have to work. And that was it. And guess why this happened? It wasn't really a cultural thing. I mean, it transferred itself into culture, but the reason why that happened is that because these populations lived in two environments where basically, that was the more economic way of living. That is to say, it's, the places they lived were so poor that basically it's better to go rob someone else, with raiding warfare and all this stuff, and those were then working, and that is obvious. Look at the spread of agriculture, how also livestock worked there, because it was all about this lower rate of growth that required that when there was a crisis, there was no other way to survive than go take resources from someone else. And that's how it was basically all before agriculture, if you want. And that's why civilizations and military and war actually begins with such things, because before there was no way. There was definitely now talking about prehistoric warfare is very complicated, but it's also very fascinating. So definitely I don't know, the military genius definitely also existed before, There are certain, when you look at those cave paintings with all those hunters running around wild animals and stuff like that, you realize that there is it's a sort of war plan. There is surely sometimes a prehistoric Hannibal behind that, and you can't see that there is an incredible intelligence, but it's still not war in the way we intend them in terms of historical, and it also actually real war begins before probably, and not really probably, but it starts before what we make history starting from. That is more than, let's say, a couple of not a couple but some millennia old, but we will talk about this another time. But just for saying, however, that those were more primitive societies that necessarily had to work in that way, and that therefore into which the military genius, let's say, this capability of even assessing of risk and all this stuff was more widespread, because it simply was more frequent to find yourself into that situation. What is interesting here is that intelligence get channeled throughout the civilization progress. Now, von Clausewitz will show us why. That's the reason why we don't have basically a complete or particularly elevated military genius in these primitive societies, but we have only in the greater and more developed ones. Because in fact he has already no, he has not finished the concept. Let's read it here. It says, for in the former, that is to say, to the wild warlike race, almost every warrior possesses military genius, whilst in the civilized world, masses are only carried away by it from necessity, never by inclination. This is also very important. That is, humans, this is a great lesson, because it basically tells you that natural enmity and aggressiveness is always there. That is to say, none of us has abandoned our primitive need to be aggressive, to potentially have to deal with fight, with war, with this idea that you have to fight once again. So the myth, the culturalist fairy tale that war is something that only psychopaths do, bloodthirsty people do, is just for children, of course. It's an insult to the dignity of the average human intelligence, exactly because human intelligence is set on this basis. Human intelligence is made to react. We know it basically from any science. We know it from anthropology. We know it from neurobiology. We know it from evolutionary studies. We know from history. We know it from everywhere. Just a child could build, but not even a child, because children are usually pretty evil, and then they know what it means. They like the fight. They like the idea of there's also beautiful literature on this. Let's say ingenious, naive adults with some weird intellectual deficits can't believe that humans are intrinsically good. It is true that most of humans are not definitely set on killing others. That's the truth. But potentially we can become. I mean, the truth is most humans, aside from psychopaths, and this is really true, or people who have, because there are distinctions. Basically, the great killers are either psychopaths or people who are were used to take care of their own family by themselves. So they're kind of leaders a bit on their own, who have to accept responsibility and all this stuff. The rest of humans and people who can kill pretty easily. Look at the recipients of military distinctions. You find these two psychological profiles are basically all about it, and the average of humans are simply made to shout at a distance, throw some rocks at a distance, and then to stay there for a while, letting adrenaline consuming them and being exhausted, and then going away. But it is true that under particular conditions of threat, of stress, and other things, every single human can turn into a killer in less than 3 seconds. And that's how nature set us to survive. And a person who can't believe that this is just cultural, it's just an ignorant. And by the way, it's something you find basically all over the animal kingdom. Basically, it's the standard everywhere. So, aside from this, what von Clausewitz is telling us is that in civilization, what happens is that we are artificially brought by society, by policy, to dedicate ourselves into other things, that are obviously work. Think when mankind discovered agriculture and how it worked. Well, definitely at that point you realize, that people were intelligent enough to say, okay, if I do this, I will store much more resources than by hunting and gathering, and therefore I will become wealthier. And that's how civilizations were born. But that required basically being drawn away essentially from the natural inclination of mankind. That is to say, we are still hunter-gatherers mentally speaking, and we still behave like that. Only we do it in a society that doesn't correspond anymore to that one. So that's why by the way, human mind is capable of an extraordinary ability of adaptation. Human mind is extremely flexible. So also, the great philosophical problems, the fact that society is not perfect, is not adapted to our biological roots. Well, it is true. We do live in an artificial world, but we still know how to adapt to it mentally. And not by enormous stress. And the proof is that although definitely there are certain pathologies that are kind of typical of certain contexts, like now, if you look at suicide rates among teenagers, that's a problem, that's increasing. But overall, we live in a heck of a good way. I mean, what is poor today is something most of the people were craving for only 100 years ago. So all this whining also about our problems now today is frankly one of the most childish things ever, because we have never lived in a better way ever in history. And go tell it loud to survivalists as well, that I doubt they really know what they're talking about. But there is some doubt about, I don't want to be so radical about that, but they're very complex topics, but there is still a pretty solid evidence that, after all, things are not at all bad as they used to be for most of our history, at least. Now I don't want to enter into other questions in terms of what's happiness and why. Also, material wealth is obvious, and also maybe life quality is not all about, in fact, prosperity, how we have pictured it, especially from the 19th to 20th century. But let's leave this aside because it's too big. What von Clausewitz is saying here is that in civilized peoples, civilized developed societies, the military genius doesn't serve to you in daily life anymore. That's the great struggle between shepherds and agriculturers, right? Shepherd is usually more warlike than the agriculturer, but on average, the agriculturer fares better than the shepherd. That's also why the shepherd usually raids the agricultural lands and all this stuff. So that's another proof that civilization does improve in that sense. So civilization basically rationalizes the fact that you don't need to have this shared military genius anymore, at least to cultivate it, because by inclination you have it with your aggressiveness, with your primitive hatred and all that defines human existence. but you don't need to be educated to that like a warrior would do. So that's why it's also particularly stupid to call today the military like, those are our warriors. Those are not, because our civilization has freaking improved, and that's the military. And that's a very different thing from warriors. That's a much more serious, sophisticated, and evoluted thing, and calling them warriors is basically regressing in in actual, and that's also, by the way, it's risky, because of course it's not that we're going back to tribes in the real sense, in the fullest sense of the word, but at the same time, mentalities and opinions like this that are dramatically widespread, incomprehensibly, maybe not so incomprehensibly appealing, because still it's that inclination that makes us think like that, that we are the tribe, whoa, whoa, those are our warriors, that's the concept, right? But still, the problem is that we are lacking the culture and the intellectual development to make a proper use of our own military in that way, because we don't understand fundamentally what it's there for, and that's a serious problem. Because also, well, let's not go to beyond now, but that's the point though is that what a specialized civilization can do, that is a developed civilization that can dedicate and invest, in fact, resources and into very specific activities that can all be combined, makes saving a lot of resources. At that point, you also have the intellectual abilities that develop in parallel to manage and to combine and to apply in a more effective manner. That's why the warrior gets his ass kicked, because that's the destiny of the warrior, right? It's not the destiny of winning. That's a primitivistic behavior and thinking. A warrior, by the way, fights largely for his own honor, because that's what's basically the range of his political and social interaction is. The soldier should be a citizen, for example, and that's a way more evoluted way of looking at yourself. That is, in fact, proper of more advanced civilizations. So I know I'm radical in kind of, I realize probably that many people will, find my words kind of arrogant, but they're really not. I mean, I can't tell you this is truthfully how things are. And I'm kind of bringing on this campaign against this terming, like, that there is a sort of warrior. Here, many people, I believe that part of this it really stems from a poor interpretation of von Clausewitz, because here really the von Clausewitz, what defines as the genius for war, the military genius, is being translated like kind of the warrior thing, because in German it's really similar in its meaning, but it's still not the same thing. And this is, we're talking about the military genius, not the warrior genius in the sense of the warrior, the tribesman, right? It's a very different thing. So that's why partly sometimes adopted this myth, because of poor understanding of wording this matter. And in fact, you can understand that those people haven't read von Clausewitz, because if they had read this passage and of the Vom Kriege, actually, they would understand what here the genius of war really means, the genius for war, right? So not really what they believe the warrior is. And the reason why this happens, by the way, is aside from obvious ignorance of these matters, but that inclination, the same von Clausewitz talks about, that is to say that to us, on average, as human beings, the warrior, the tribesman model is more appealing. And guess why? Because it's more instinctive. It's closer to our biological nature. The one of the citizen soldier is not. That's something that developed with civilization, something that it's costly, it takes intellect, reason, it goes beyond from the animal-like instinct to fight. That's the distinction the Greeks made back in the day between, and I always remember, between Athena and Ares. Because Athena, they're both gods of war. The Greeks do not have only one god of war, Ares, that is usually remembered. That's that they are two, and they're on equal level, and actually Athena is, telling the truth, superior. Athena is the goddess of war, and she is also the goddess of wisdom, of reason. And she always wins over Ares. There's not even a single time, and it's obvious. It's completely obvious. It couldn't be otherwise, in which Ares wins over Athena. It's madness. It doesn't happen. The Greeks had figured it out, and that's obvious. That the animal-like, the beast-like character of prestige of the warrior that thinks to be so cool, so powerful, gets smashed by a simple guy that is maybe is not a warrior, but is more intelligent. What's the Greeks had based their civilization, in turn our Western civilization, in let's say, at least in the modernistic approach to it, into, I mean, in the idea that reason is superior to instinct, and it is held true, definitely. So, and that's why the Greeks were citizens, fighting for their own city, in fact, and that emerged as a political institutional model against the tribal aristocracy that, for example, fought on horseback, while the hoplites didn't. So it's interesting because the hoplite was definitely not a warrior. The hoplite is, by definition, a guy who stays there that doesn't fight ever, doesn't even train for war, because that's something beast-like, it's barbarian-like. Only the Spartans do that. They're the only exception, and by the way, they do it worse individually than the average, I don't know, Celtic warrior, the average Illyrian warrior. Yeah. But they win because they do it in organized form, and that's how reason prevails over instinct, and that's why the soldier prevails over the warrior, always. So there is no pride taken from saying that you're a warrior. There is not. That only reveals your cultural limits, nothing else. And the sad thing I've met around now, I don't want to, but many people who buy this, even from the other side. I mean, even people who are not much civilians. That, I mean, obviously also in civilians believe this garbage, but the serious problem, sometimes some military men believe it too. And that's kind of tragic, but I have a lot of respect for the military. I hope I don't be taken for someone who doesn't like the military. I also wanted to join it, actually, but turned out I wasn't mentally fit for it. So like 70% of people who went there, because that's the normality. And that was, by the way, a beautiful experience, because it really showed me how that works from the internal. I understand a lot of things about things like discipline, and the whole, leaving aside the commitment that obviously a military man does in his career, in his duty, and his honor, and the allegiance to his nation and institutions, but also the real sense of how what von Clausewitz is talking about in here, that there is channeling that this warlike spirits into those who have to fight in that way, but not as warriors anymore, or at least in a way that is far more enhanced and has to do more with intellectual capabilities than physical ones. And in this, I don't even want to diminish the warrior in itself. For example, you don't have to think absolutely, whoever you are, that you are more intelligent, I don't know, than a 7th century Bulgar cavalryman. You're not. because that guy had a mind that you can only dream of. But at the same time, you live in a society that can smash a 7th century Bulgar army without even, getting to contact, because you have, more than 1 millennium of civilization under your feet, better than on your shoulders. So that's really the top of which you stand, right? But so there is a warlike intelligence that, in this sense, is also part of the warrior in itself, but it's way further enhanced when it takes to deal with things that warriors couldn't know. What a warrior could understand of an armored corps maneuvering, or even just a division. I mean, it's very complicated, and that's why von Clausewitz now explains us that the military genius actually pertained to worlds that were far more advanced to the tribal ones, for which you don't remember basically any true military genius from small tribes, but just people that maybe were particularly courageous, maybe they had even a certain talent, but they couldn't express because they lived in a world where the intellectual means were limited for that, and they couldn't practice them, and they couldn't cultivate them. And the military genius does need to be cultivated to be effective. So there is definitely a cultural limit into this. That stems, however, from much more, structural and inescapable limits, of course. So, in fact, von Clausewitz says right here, but amongst uncivilized people, we never find a really great general, and very seldom what we can properly call a military genius, because that requires a development of the intelligent powers which cannot be found in an uncivilized state. And that makes you understand how important reason is, right? And once again in here, by reason, we don't mean that warriors back in the day didn't have reason. Of course they had. They were human beings. But it was applied to systems that were relatively simpler. Relatively. Because still you wouldn't be able, as I said before, to solve the strategical, tactical problems that a Bulgar cavalryman, I fixed myself with this Bulgar cavalryman now, did. But still, the Bulgar cavalryman couldn't cope with your best military genius in your own civilization now, right? That has trained that military genius to be far superior than others, right? And still, this could go further, because the military genius is applied in also, let's say, in different circumstances. That is to say that those ingredients that we were talking about before, given their interaction and let's say level of power, are, according to their various combinations, can be more or less fitting to a certain level of requirement. That is to say that a platoon commander has a different intelligence than a company commander. That in turn has a different intelligence from a division commander, right? So for which maybe the division commander would suck to be a platoon commander. So it's also very much more modulated what it is, but still you have this hierarchy that tells you that still it kind of improves the whole load of elements you have to take into consideration the more the thing goes up, right? Yet this doesn't mean that in fact everybody's capable to do the same exact thing. So the military genius is fundamentally to be found mostly to generals, because overall it requires more. It doesn't require the same thing that it requires to a sergeant, but on average it tends to be far wider and more complex and more complicated. All right, and nobody's a superhero. This is also very important to understand. So this is not to glorify particular individuals that are generals that are utter rubbish. Just study history. But still, our social hierarchies are developed in a similar way, and they tend to be based on merit, by the way. And that's something evolutionarily and kind of in its artificiality, in the sense that our civilization is far different from our hunter-gatherer world, but it's still kind of functional. And this is something astonishing about human beings, is that they are able to organize themselves in functional ways that tend to refine themselves. So even when the the original environment they have been molded into, biologically speaking, is radically changed, right? So this is particularly important, is that not only there is a real cultural limit in terms of development of military genius up to a certain standard, and that's why certain levels cannot be reached in the absence of a kind of a structural development in the field of intellect. Then von Clausewitz says that a civilized people may also have a warlike tendency, and development is a matter of course. That is to say that every society in itself has its own levels of development, of complexity that requires this progressive, even the progress in itself, that without which obviously there could be no improvement, but that is therefore capable of doing in different degrees this kind of operations. And then he says, and the more this is the more this is general, the more frequently also will military spirit be found in individuals in their armies. Which is to say in here, not that we're not talking about soldiers, we're talking about the amount of, let's say, generals, to make an approximations, that own that military genius. In fact, von Clausewitz explains this better. Now, as this coincides in such case with the higher degree of civilization, therefore from such nations have issued forth the most brilliant military exploit, as the Romans and the French have exemplified. So von Clausewitz tells you, look at Rome, look at modern France. This have been by far the civilizations that have produced more military genius, greatest military commanders, simply because they had this level of development, right? So that's clear. And I just remembered that von Clausewitz was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, and all of them. So, as a Prussian, he obviously recognizes all the great French military tradition that was by far the most, imposing at that time. It would remain for quite a long time, actually, before it was in turn the same Prussians that kind of embodied now this new development that stemmed greatly, in fact, from intellectual capabilities. But now we open too great parentheses more than else. Von Clausewitz says then, the greatest names in this and in all other nations that have been renowned in war belong strictly to epochs of higher culture. This is true, and you can see it quite easily, and historically speaking. Sometimes you look at those lists of who was the greatest commander of those times. You find all these lists that sometimes are so ridiculous. And I'm talking about all times. Like, for example, seeing Rommel continuously in every kind of list of the best World War II commanders is like not really having understood very well World War II is, and still there are millions of people still believing such a thing. These things are important because you don't have to take into consideration the charisma, the name. The more you do it, you're basically going back to tribalism. You go back to a sort of inferior level of development, even in your intellectual capabilities. An easy way to debunk those lists is to look at what kind of commanders we're talking about, from which kind of civilizations were coming, for which rank they had, that is how and what they really commanded actually, and to be a bit more honest about this, say, scale, and to identify correctly names, not because just they sound mythical, but because you're able of a concrete military criticism and analysis. That is something that is very difficult to have on average. But sometimes we want and we need them, because evidently we feel those instincts, we feel those inclinations for which we want just the leader to follow, which is typical of chieftains or retinues, and not of citizen soldiers. And therefore, when you look at that stuff and you say, well, it kind of sucks, it's not really, oh, well, just, those are kids. Yeah, they're probably kids who write those things, etc. But at the same time, it's really not. It's kids in the non, let's say, anaggraphic sense of the term. That is, you can be a kid even if you're 80 years old. Still, and that's a serious issue, because it's part of that intellectual development that Von Clausewitz is talking about. That is to say, if a society is intellectually depressed, that cannot understand the difference between a Rommel and a Guderian, or von Manstein, well, you have some problem even politically. You have some problem even as a citizen. And a very serious one. You would say, well, but just that's just kind of a joke level. Well, not really, because you're still pushing a sort of fake and completely disproportionate hierarchy and with attached value assessment that confuses whoever wants to look at those things, educationally speaking, to improve himself. And that's one of the reasons why I think there is a political crisis, especially also when you don't know much about these topics, when you don't know much about war or military history. Which is not a way to say, oh well, because you study that, so you feel you to be better just because. No, I don't. I personally also don't believe to be a particularly talented, military intelligence. Let's call it this. Let's put it in this way. But I believe that's an important one, because we have. Such observation can be criticized. Because, in fact, for people knowing about war, military history is just knowing about something else. That is, about watches, or about fashion, or about something like that. No, it's really not. It's something really important beyond your personal tastes. Every citizen should know about politics, war, and society. If he or she has those that the Clausewitzian trinity in mind, things tend to be better. And that's what the Vom Kriege really serves to, because it's not a frivolous or extemporary consideration of war. It's really a desperate call, at the same time loaded with a lot of hope, by the way, into human intelligence. And this was a man that knew what intelligence was and was capable of. So because he had to test that on his own skin and other people's skins on the battlefield, making a difference between life and death, to understand, for humanity, in fact, to understand how deep and radically important these problems are, and how they have to be understood. So, in my opinion, yeah, the more a lot of, I would say that even the moral stagnation, etc., does stem from the lack of understanding of history, I believe, but especially this history, especially military history, and it's and I would and maybe even beyond, maybe even beyond, because here we're not talking about merely military history that can be all and nothing. Military history is everything that concerns wars as they are, but it can be also something relatively, detached from it. I mean, you can study even, how logistics works, and that's useful, but maybe, you concentrate in certain aspects of production, or then that may be useful, but what I think really important is the military art. That is to say, how armies evolve and progress over time, and for which function, for which reason. And that's not something strictly military, as we've seen in Clausewitzian thought, but also political and social, because you cannot understand that evolution if you don't understand those other two things. So that's the only thing that really pushes you in many ways to take into consideration those aspects. I've been talking with lots of people, sometimes my colleagues at university, that were maybe particularly, they studied history, maybe they were particularly interested just in policy, in politics, or in society, but they completely lacked interest or understanding in this broad, strictly military dynamic. That is how armies work, and therefore also the military art proper. Because it's as if, I'm not saying that politics and society are something, let's say, easy to understand, but they're relatively something you live into. War is not something you live into, but that is still there in potential. And if you exclude that potential, you seriously mess up your understanding both of politics and of society. And it's very, very easy to fall prey of ideologism along this path, if you miss that. It's as if, an organism, you take away one part, you need necessarily a compensation for it, that, if you don't get something functional, will make the same organism still missing that part in a negative way for the rest of it. So it's really serious. Then for Clausewitz says, from this we may infer how great a share the intelligent powers have in superior genius. And that's the real point. How intelligent powers, here we're not talking about brave powers, we don't talk about proud powers, we don't talk about, powers we're willing just to risk for the sake of it, but intelligent powers, that is, powers that are able to read through. Intelligence is a difficult thing. Intelligence is never the immediate, the intuitive. There is intuition in the military genius as well, and we will see it, and that's particularly important, because otherwise it would be all about a calculation. Von Clausewitz rejects this deeply. But it's mostly intelligence, right? It's most about reading through what is not evident. That is, you have a barrier, and you have to break that barrier, to permeate it, to look beyond. That's what really intelligence is about. And it's not intuitive, because the trouble with intelligence is that the person who doesn't read through, can be shown the thing 1,000 times. If it doesn't apply, will not get through it. So that's why lots of people everywhere live with reality in front of their eyes, but are not able to see it for real. That's why it takes also education. It takes to be cultivated in this endeavor, in this which is a struggle really, because intelligence takes also a freaking lot of resources away. And that's what the military genius is mostly associated to, but not exclusively. So don't make the mistake to say, okay, well, it just takes to be intelligent, and that intelligent in war is all about intelligence. It's not. But yet it's mostly about it. It's mostly about it. So that war is not merely an intellectual struggle, but it largely is. It's not exclusively an intellectual struggle, but largely it is. And then von Clausewitz says, we shall now look more closely into this point, and this is something we will read next time. So, yeah, I don't add anything. I think it is enough. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.